Hi, everybody. Today is August 4th, 2022, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Viral Conversation. We're doing our series of coronavirus conversations, never-ending topic, unfortunately for the world. We're enjoying it. I think probably it, should have had its peak a couple of years ago, but people still find permutations and ramifications, and perhaps they enjoy kind of being in the forefront of the news. I'm really honored to present a distinguished guest today, Dr. Russell Blaylock, who's a neurosurgeon in Canton, Mississippi. I believe he's retired. He's also editor of certain branch subject matter academic journals, and he's going to be able to describe those better than I. I brought him on the show because, in a sense, he's a profile in courage. He writes really wonderfully. He has a clear voice, which I'm sure you'll hear as he speaks, and I'm going to stop speaking so you can hear him do that. But just before I do that, I just want to mention he has a couple of articles out that are very interesting formulations and overviews of what has happened with COVID-19 and our responses to it. So without further ado, Dr. Blaylock, would you like to, how much did I get wrong in my introduction, first of all?
No, you're right on target. Right on target. I do research, what I call theoretical neuroscience research. And what I do, I'm looking into mechanism of neurological diseases, and I'm also I deal with cancer, and I've written a number of articles on cancer as well as neurological problems. And I'm an editor-in-chief of Surgical Neurology International Journal in two sections. One is neuroinflammatory disorders, and the other is neuropsychiatry. But that's what I do with what little spare time I have since I retired from neurosurgery.
So neurosurgery, COVID-19, that the intersection not necessarily obvious. Where does Russell Blaylock come into the conversation, and how did you enter the conversation, and what part did you play, and how has it played out?
Well, I've done research in vaccines for a very long period of time, working primarily in the field of autism and the spectrum disorders associated with autism. So I've done a lot of writing in that area in peer-reviewed journals, and worked out the mechanism by which this is occurring. So this is a field of the vaccine brain injury relationship that I'm quite familiar with, as well as some of the things that's in the adjuvants of vaccine. So when this vaccine came out, I researched messenger RNA type technology and familiarized myself with all of the different things that were involved with it, and started really reading some of Dr. Malone's material of the mechanism. And of course, being that I'm kind of a bridge between what Dr. Malone talks about on an immunological basis, as well as the pathophysiological of how that affects the brain and the rest of the body. That's what I'm doing. What does this new technology do actually, and why is it dangerous? Why should it be stopped?
So that's a lot to parse. I'd like to kind of go backwards a little bit. So you're talking about autism and vaccines. Now, that in itself has always been a kind of a powder keg of an issue. And where does medicine stand regarding those thoughts? Are you saying that vaccines in general present an autism risk, like pre-COVID-19 vaccines? We're talking about the standard panoply of childhood vaccines. Are you a recommendor or opposed to routine vaccinations? I mean, how does this kind of play in?
Well, for the longest, we had difficulty proving our point that the vaccines, because of the number of them that were being given, particularly early in life, were causing neurodevelopmental problems. That is, the brain was not developing properly, and that this had a lifelong effect. Now that's pretty well proven. So some of our early suppositions now are well proven, and we know that the more vaccines you give, the closer together, early in life, are going to produce autism, and now we know also schizophrenia if given during the third trimester of pregnancy. I think it's a better way to protect the public. We know now nutritionally you can stimulate the immune system, particularly the innate immune system, to protect you against almost all viruses. And I'm 76 years old, almost 77, and I don't take any medications. And the only thing I take to stimulate my immunity is some natural compound. I never get the flu. I never had the COVID. I don't get these things. I don't get colds. And my wife doesn't either. My father, my mother never took a flu vaccine. They never took any vaccines. And the studies now clearly show, and when they compared vaccinated and unvaccinated children, the unvaccinated children are by far healthier in all spectrum. The vaccinated children, the more they get, the more of these vaccines they receive, the more they have autoimmune diseases, asthma and psoriasis and type 1 diabetes. They're having a number of long-term health consequences because it's the way you're stimulating the immune system. And until recently, no one even recognized that it's a Th2 type stimulation by all vaccines, which is not stimulating your innate immune system. It's actually suppressing your immunity, putting you at higher risk.
For the audience, what's Th2?
Well, we know that the immune system has a what we call Th1, Th2 type helper T cells. And the purpose of that is if you want to kill a virus or a bacteria or something invading your body, it's your Th1 is the most important if you're going to stimulate something.
And what does the Th stand for?
It's a T cell helper.
Okay.
Cell. And the Th2 is sort of dampening that, is that it tends to suppress the immune reaction and mainly raises antibody levels. Well, unfortunately, they've convinced most of the public and most physicians that you want to stimulate antibodies, but these are non-neutralizing antibodies. And they actually increase your risk of becoming infected and dying from an infection.
How so?
And that's what we call antibody-dependent enhancement.
Right, well, ADE. I've heard of that. In regard actually to coronavirus vaccines in the interregnum, the time between 2003 SARS, which would be COVID-1, and 2019-20 SARS-CoV-2, COVID. There were papers on vaccines that there was no vaccine produced for the original SARS, despite the long lead time, 16 years between those episodes, and there were episodes apparently seen of AD, antibody dependent enhancement, with attempts at doing a COVID original SARS vaccine. Are you familiar with those studies?
That's correct. And what they found is the people who had the vaccine for SARS-CoV-1, if they were exposed to the virus again, they're much more likely to die or have a severe reaction. The unvaccinated did far better, and we see the same thing with the MERS. We saw it with the H1N1 vaccine. The same thing happened. It's people who were vaccinated. If they were exposed to the H1N1 virus, they had a much worse outcome than the unvaccinated. And so as we've learned more about this, we call it immune imprinting.
No, I appreciate that. I'm going to, I would love to see some of the things you're talking about, in print and be able to kind of judge it. My general impression, I'm pro-vaccine. I've taken the flu shot every year. So, I'm also kind of minimal on the medications. I don't take pills for colds, and, I don't take anti-inflammatory when I have a muscle ache. I kind of stay away and let the body heal itself and try to avoid things that hurt and all that kind of stuff. And, and I'm 66, so I'm relatively healthy for that age. I'm still out playing tennis, as I was mentioning before. But I take the flu. In practice, I would take for my primary care medical practice, I would take the influenza vaccine every year because one time I didn't, and I got a really bad flu, and I would see people with influenza over and over and over again. Maybe I'm not sure whether in neurosurgery you have the kind of the same, person-to-person contact, but I'm like, people are coughing. They come to me because they're sick. And, so I found, I think, relative benefit in getting the flu shot yearly. And the question I would have for you is, the Spanish flu we hear about in 1918 was devastating, and it cut across age groups to a far greater extent than SARS-1 or SARS-2, COVID-19 did. And there were far more people of younger cohort at a higher mortality rate than anything we've seen for a similarly vaccine naive population in 2020. But the actual influenza virus of that year, which I think was emanated from China originally, also, I think was seen again. I forget whether it was the Hong Kong flu in 1958 or one of these years came along, and we had a vaccine by then, and we didn't see the same devastation from Spanish flu that we saw in a vaccinated population. Do you think that, leaving aside Dr. Blaylock and Dr. Bach as, kind of maybe slightly anomalous, healthy guys and so forth, you think on a population level that we would do better not vaccinated for flu? I mean, is that something you would recommend, especially given some of the devastation we saw pre-vaccine era?
Yeah, when we look at the data, and the CDC even had this during the influenza, seasonal influenza, was that people who were obese, who smoked, who had comorbid diseases were the ones that were being hospitalized, that were dying, and that young, healthy people didn't have a problem. If you had a bad flu, it usually meant there's something wrong with your diet and your immune system. It's not that it's a particularly virulent virus necessarily. The studies on the efficiency of this vaccine is about 16% for the flu vaccine. So it's not very effective. For small children, 4 years and less, its effectiveness is zero. They did a 30-year study on the effectiveness of the vaccine to prevent the main reasons they tell elderly to take the vaccine, that is hospitalizations, death, and pneumonia. And over 30 years, with increasing use of the vaccine, they found there was no benefit whatsoever. So for the reasons you're taking it, that's to prevent hospitalizations and pneumonia and death, it had no effectiveness in this 30-year study. And I repeated a similar study and found the same thing. So, and they also found that people who took the flu vaccine repeatedly year after year, for the next 2 years after that, risk of developing pneumonia and serious pneumonia. So all of this goes along with what we're finding with this immune imprinting, is that the vaccine process, particularly with the adjuvants, that's what's causing the problem, is the adjuvant. And the adjuvants of aluminum and previously mercury, and there's still some mercury in some of the flu vaccine. But that accumulates in the brain, accumulates in the heart and various tissues. And it's a long-term pro-inflammatory response from these metals that are locked into the mitochondria and the microglia and the macrophage cells. So now we have a pretty good mechanism, as we know why, if you keep taking these vaccines. And I've seen a lot of neurological disorders. My parents never took a flu vaccine. My wife's parents never took one. And they never had a bad flu in their life. But they didn't do a lot of things that the general public does that will weaken your immune system. That's the problem.
So you're saying they stayed fit, they weren't smoking, they weren't drinking, that kind of thing? And
their diet was proper. I mean, there's a lot of dietary things that are powerful immune suppressants that people don't know about.
When you say dietarily, how so? What are you talking about?
For instance, the omega-6 fats, corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, these oils are immune suppressing, particularly when they're oxidized. We know that a deficiency in magnesium, a deficiency in zinc, a deficiency in vitamin C all raises your susceptibility to these infections because it weakens the immune system. The immune system is highly dependent on these nutrients because when you get infected, your body has to produce billions of white blood cells. It has to produce this cell reproduction at a very high rate, which requires a high intake of nutrients. And we look at people who do this, who follow these diets, who take these oral immune stimulants. They don't get sick very often.
Hmm. Well, I'm going to have I am skeptical about that because it's hard to trade anecdote for data, and um, you know I I'm on a personal basis. I think I philosophically align with some of the things you're saying. I don't do any supplements. I don't do any additions to my diet. Frankly, I don't really pay that much attention to my dietary intake per se. I mean, I watch what I eat so it doesn't spill on my shirt. And I watch what I eat so the dog doesn't get it. But I think that I don't put that much stock into food types per se. I think food is fuel. It's a blessing we have enough to live on. Even worse than having McDonald's is starvation. And so I think that there are nutrients that we get, and we're very good at kind of I guess accumulating those from the diet we need, and so too can other animals. Raccoons, don't need dietary supplements, and giraffes and zebras and so forth. They don't have a GNC store to go to. So I think animals have acclimated to their diets and vice versa in a sense. We have this thing where we are superannuated. We live far longer than all the other animals in the jungle and the forests and all that kind of stuff because we have civilization. So we have a happy solution to so much of life's disorders, hypothermia, hyperthermia, starvation, thirst, and all kinds of stuff because we have civilization. We figured out an answer to almost everything. But now we live longer, so now we have all these kind of secondary disease of degeneration and whatnot because we're not supposed to live forever either. So I kind of have a hard time with that. I think it would be shocking to me and surprising to see that vaccines across the board are antithetical to the general purpose of health reduction. So I'm a little bit skeptical on that. So I'm going to ask you after we're done to maybe put some articles up so people can see those and you can make your case. But I'd actually like to segue a little bit into the COVID article you wrote, which I guess got kind of a big splash. I mean, you're welcome to rebut. First of all, you're welcome to rebut anything I've said just now before you segue. So I don't want to cut you off. But if you're interested in segueing, moving on to the COVID bit, you had an article. Maybe you could describe what it was about, what your basic thesis is. People can obviously read it, but if you maybe could give a high-level summary and talk about the reception and the ramifications, the repercussions, so forth. I'd like to hear that.
Well, just to basically rebut what you said about the nutrition, this is something I've spent the past 30 years studying. There's a tremendous amount of literature, scientific literature, powerful literature. I have had people that I know were devastated by the virus that recommended they put themselves on these things and had rapid improvement and recovery. And the scientific evidence is very powerful, very powerful. It's not anecdotal. The things that you said are something that we thought maybe 30, 40 years ago, there wasn't a lot of hard science. There's enormous amounts of science on all of these nutritional things. It's a very rapidly expanding field, and it goes into some very deep cell signaling processes and mechanisms, and that's far, far beyond that. And our diet, the American diet, is probably the most unhealthy diet in the world. And these things have a profound effect on immune resistance to disease. It's not minor, it's major. We know that the vaccines don't react very well. For instance, if you're zinc deficient, the mortality.
No, I have heard that.
It's proven. I mean, they did that in Africa. But just to get into the article,
Yeah, no, I'm going to give one slight rebuttal to your rebuttal, which is that, insofar as we always hear the U.S. diet is, deficient and bad. So, I'm working on a separate book on cancer. It's kind of an overview. It's kind of a dummies, cancer 101, dummies kind of guide to cancer, which sounds silly, but I think it's an interesting book. It's there to kind of not make cancer, not put a happy face on cancer, but to talk about the different types of cancers, and again, in a sense, how it's a disease of success. As I was mentioning before, back ancestrally, our ancient cultures, we didn't have worries about cancer because everyone lived to 25 or 27 or so forth. So a lot of what we see today is the success of living longer, and we are going to die from something that happens be cancer when you've eliminated all of the war, pestilence, disease, and all that kind of stuff. But my point I was going to get to is that life expectancy has been increasing across the board. I think Africa lags for a variety of reasons, poverty probably predominant, but the diets are varied highly, from Japan to India to Spain to Argentina and so forth. But pretty much life expectancy is nearly identical in all of the developed world. And I think this points probably to the fact that the larger, kind of motivator and engine towards longevity is, basically all the creature comforts. We have a better sewage system. We're not, self-infecting with cholera, from our drinking water and so forth. As society has moved to the flush toilet, to better water systems, education, homes, we don't have as many people kind of washed away in floods and all that kind of stuff. People live longer, and so that, but again, it's across the board. And the diet in Japan is not the same as the diet in China, which is not the same as the diet in Kazakhstan, which is not, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, longevity has massively increased by decades across the board around the world. And again, Africa as well is increasing, but they're a little bit lagging behind.
Well, part of that is an illusion we hear, and I used to believe this, that people, they would say, oh, well, people, in the 1500s only lived to be 35 years of age. Well, that's not true. They lived as long as we do now. What was killing them was infectious diseases, and like you say, the thing that had to do with public health. Public health changed that, so more people were able to reach that longevity level. But what we're seeing now is that people are starting to reverse this. They're starting to die sooner. There's an article out of England which shows that the neurological diseases is exploding. We're seeing a dramatic increase in these diseases. So we're undergoing a reversal now, and most of it is because of the food supply, the processed foods. When we compare diets in these areas, the book, The Blue Zones, but if you read Blue Zone book, what he did is it was a study to see why do certain people in the world live at such a high rate in their 90s and 100s. And the Blue Zone found that there were certain dietary things that were characteristic of these people. That's why they were living longer. For instance, we know that the Intuits that live in Alaska and the northern polar areas, they never get autoimmune diseases. But if they move here and they consume our diet, they get autoimmune diseases just like we do. So the diet can make profound differences. Now, autoimmune disease is exploding in this country.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, I'm kind of a skeptic kind of guy, so I apologize. And some of those things can also be societal, and it also could be a matter of testing. If the Inuit community up in North Alaska or Yukon, whatever, they're not necessarily testing for lupus. They got more things on their plate. I had a post on my Facebook the other day looking at Tanzania, or unless it's Tanzania, based on pronunciation, but I always call it Tanzania, versus Italy. They have nearly the identical population, 60 million people, and there have been, effectively essentially zero COVID deaths in Tanzania, and X hundreds of thousands in Italy, and number of cases, minuscule. I mean, does the virus not know how to infect people in Africa, or do they just not test or not care because they've got many other worse problems like feeding the people, getting to work, and so forth? They don't necessarily have the time. There was an episode, I think, in medical school. I forget who the professor, but he was talking about back pain, and he said, this goes back, the prehistoric era when I was in medical school. at least before the personal computer, at the very least. Anyway, he said, in certain parts of Africa at the time, they did not really have a medical terminology for back pain because there was no way of collecting. People didn't have disability payments. They didn't have out of work notes. People were working and they were working at subsistence level. And if you had back pain, it's like, okay, well, whatever, have a rash, whatever. You still go to work because otherwise you're going to starve. So it was kind of a distinction without a difference. It didn't make any difference in your day one way or the other. So they didn't really categorize or back pain to the same extent that we've kind of parsed it down to this type and that type. So they didn't really have the issues. And the same thing, I kind of wonder whether that exists with the kind of near zero numbers of COVID-19, and certainly it's not been in the news about any part of sub-Saharan Africa. To a certain extent, South Africa, which is I guess the wealthiest part of southern Africa, even still, after the, some amount of decline. But I guess I do have a point here, which is that, things can change. If you take your Inuit from, Alaska, and then they're living longer or they're getting tested more, they might find more lupus or something like that. It may not be something that happens in a more subsistence level existence, just like COVID-19 is not really seen in sub-Saharan Africa. That was my point.
Well, that's not true, because this was careful record taking in the Intuit in these areas, and when they move here and assume our diet, they begin to get autoimmune diseases just like we do. We see the same thing with Japanese that consume a lot of fish, omega-3 fatty acids. When they come here and assume our diet, they gain obese, they develop heart disease at much higher rates than in the countries where they stick to their diet. This has been shown consistently all over the world in various countries. This is
okay.
So scientific studies that carefully follow this.
And I buy into the part of what you're saying there, but I'm not sure it's diet so much as obesity. So the net result, if you're carrying around a BMI of 30, 35 or something like that, and you have a lot of extra padding, I think almost everything you're saying is going to be reasonably accurate. But I'm not sure it necessarily matters the food you ingested to get overweight. So an overweight Latino might have eaten a lot of, I don't want to get into cultural tropes here, but a lot of, Latino food. And the Japanese, to get overweight here, whatever. So they might have eaten different things, but at that obese level of, BMI 35 for, 35 years, they're going to have similar results. They're going to both get diabetes. They're going to both get, cholesterol issues or heart, so forth. I think the pretty much it's the carrying of the weight, not so much. My own feeling medically is that it's the kind of persistent overload of the system. You're overloading your pancreas. You're overloading this, that. That's going to bring on the diabetes and all these other secondary problems. But I'm not sure, as we look around the world again, with everyone's kind of all the tides rising up, and everyone's kind of reaching greater longevity, whether in Argentina eating a lot of meat, or Japan eating a lot of fish, or India eating neither fish nor meat to the same extent. I think an obese Indian, equal sign, obese Japanese equal sign, obese Argentine, and wherever they happen to be as far as health.
Well, that's not what the studies show. The studies show that you can be obese, but if you're consuming a healthy diet, your likelihood of dying of heart attack and stroke and cancer and these various diseases is far lower than someone who's obese who has a horrible diet, eating a lot of high fructose corn syrup containing foods, a lot of things with processed foods.
All right.
Your health is much worse. You're going to have a high incidence of insulin resistance, higher incidence of hypertension. In fact, even the experts in hypertension admit we could cure most cases of hypertension by diet alone. Their response when they asked about it, well, why don't you do it? Well, people just won't. So they know dietary wise.
Well, I'm willing to be stood corrected on this, but I mean, for my own primary care practice, I had people not change their diet but change their weight, and dropping the pounds kind of made their diabetes and blood pressure numbers better. But again, so I think we could go back and forth on this a little bit. I'm going to ask you to forward me to attach this some of the articles you're talking about, and maybe we can have a little back and forth on that on the comment page. So let's finally segue, if we can, to the COVID, your kind of COVID article, and what was your basic premise? What did you cover, and what happened?
Well, basically, it's trying to cover the whole thing of what's been going on since this started. And the first paragraph of the article talks about this is probably the most manipulated, controlled epidemic, pandemic ever in the history of the world. We've never seen anything like this, the scope of this. That we're inundated with lies from people that are supposed to be positions of authority. For instance, we're talking about people who are supposed to be the experts in infectious diseases in the CDC, and the FDA is supposed to approve these things. And what we have discovered consistently is that these people are lying repeatedly. We're having things now done in medicine that's never been done in the history of the world. I mean, it's a standard of medicine. If you're going to treat an infection and be successful, you treat it as early as possible. That's your best chance of preventing a severe complication and death from the infection. For the first time in the history of the world, we've had them say, well, don't treat it early. Just stay at home, take Tylenol, drink water. And then if you become severely short of breath, come to the hospital. And if you worsen, we'll put you in the ICU and put you on a respirator. Well, early treatment that was finally offered, such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, when it came about, what we saw was that the death rate and the need for hospitalization fell precipitously. Now, this wasn't just a few studies. This was in numerous countries all over the world, Latin American countries, Asian countries, European countries. Everybody who adopted this policy saw an immediate fall in cases that needed to be hospitalized or end up in the intensive care unit, and the death rates began to fall. Well, there was an immediate attack on that, telling people not to do that, wait to get into the hospital. Physicians in the ICU, in fact, one in particular, noticed, he said, well, everybody who put on a respirator does worse, and a high percentage of them are dying. And so he separated his patients, and he just gave them high flow oxygen. And he noticed they quit dying. They started recovering much faster and left the ICU and left the hospital. He was told to leave the ICU. You can't practice here anymore.
Wow.
You've got to put them on a respirator. And then we found out that the government was paying people. The hospital was
they were paying the hospitals $13,000.
Yeah, to put on them a respirator, and $12,000 if they put them in the ICU. And then for the first time, we had this unbelievable thing where the physicians were told if a patient has any symptoms anywhere similar to COVID, when they die, you to put on their death certificate they died of COVID. If they had a PCR test within 28 days of their death, no matter what they died for, car accident, shooting, murder, jumped off a building, you're to put on their death certificate as the primary cause COVID. Well, the purpose of this was to make the United States fearful, because there were just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that we were told were dying of COVID. The people that were dying in the beginning, 50% of all the deaths in the beginning were all in nursing homes, usually in people over 80 years of age who had multiple comorbid diseases. When we looked at Italy, the same thing was found. They finally did this study in Italy, and they looked at, well, who's actually dying? The average death, over 90% of the deaths were in people over age 80 who had at least 2.5 comorbid diseases, serious diseases, and they were at the terminal point of their life. Now, when we look at people of that age and that frail condition, a common cold has an 8% mortality, just about what the COVID is.
Yeah, with the COVID, so I think it was 13% amongst the nursing homes.
It was pretty
population.
close. So
Yeah.
here's a common cold can kill these people very easily. This is why people die in that age group of a mild flu, because they're very frail. They're near the end of their life anyway. What you were doctoring the statistics to scare the public. And so then they started these lockdowns. They started masking. They started a 6-foot separation. Over time, we found out there was no scientific evidence for any of those. The 6 foot, they finally admitted, well, we made that up. Then the experts said, well, it's not spread by the particles when you talk and speak. It's spread by an aerosol, which can travel 27 feet and can fill a room. So, and then they started looking at the aerosol and they said, well, gee, almost the viruses in the aerosol are dead. So then they go back, well, now it's fomites. It's things you touch that is spreading it.
I know,
so
that's the new word I learned, fomite.
they couldn't keep their story straight. And then we need to wear a mask. Well, I did the first article ever written about the masks don't work and they're dangerous. And what I showed in this article, and I referenced it, was that we had studied the mask, trying to see if it would stop the flu transmission. All the studies consistently found no statistical evidence. And they had people even wearing the mask in their sleep. And they wore their mask at home. In other words, they wore the mask all the time. And they found no statistically significant effectiveness. And then there was a study that looked at the types of masks. And they found, well, all the masks the virus can penetrate. Even the N95 it can penetrate. So there was no scientific evidence for masking. There was no scientific evidence for the 6 foot separation. Yet they had most of the public believing this is science. This is the hard science. You need to put that mask on. Well, one of the innovative doctors did a nice demonstration. He used the vaping, and he put on every kind of mask, and he would inhale the vaping smoke, and he would exhale, and it'd go right through the mask, and go out the sides, go up his face, and go down his front of his shirt. None of these masks, cloth masks, any kind of mask you could choose, none of them were working. And of course, anybody who was out in public and you watch people that have masks, they're constantly touching it. They don't put it on right. They got the sides are open, so the breath is blowing out of it. I mean, it became so ridiculous. You walk in a restaurant, you got to have a mask on. You sit at the table for an hour talking and laughing, and you can take your mask off.
Yeah.
And then when you walk out the door, you got to put your mask back on.
No, I was at sadly, I was at a funeral last week, and even now, I'd say only about a quarter, maybe a third of the people in the sanctuary, and it was pretty tightly packed, were wearing masks, but a lot of them were, and young people. I mean, it was kind of age agnostic. And then afterwards, there was a reception and a buffet and so forth downstairs. And so, I mean, people haven't really quite figured out a way to eat with the mask on. So all the masks disappeared, and they're even more closely congregated because they're talking over their coffee and muffins and whatnot, and nobody's wearing a mask. And so how did the masks upstairs help? Which, mind you, was in a large sanctuary with I don't know 20-foot ceilings, and in the kind of tighter quarters of the function hall, they weren't. No sense. And everybody had a mask off, at least to eat. And mind you, you're in the soup anyways. I mean, I think if you're going to wear a mask, you should wear one like they wear in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is like a scuba gear. Like a bathysphere, you got basically covering and a mask that goes out, someplace else through an air filter, but the things that people are wearing, if you could like literally swim underwater and not have the water touch your face with this mask, then fine. But you're going to be breathing in and out, and the smoke one, I've seen that as well. And people going outdoors. I saw a lot of people in the we have cold weather up here. In the winter, they're wearing this mask, and you can see the condensation of their breath, and it's going right through and around and so forth. It's kind of an irrelevancy. It's all in the soup. Whatever's in the air is in the air.
Well, I did an extensive study on the mask. I wrote a long article, but in the end, I never published it. But I studied all the biomechanics of it, all the studies that had been done. They had special apparatus made. It looked like a human head that had an open mouth, and they would have the person infected breathe into it, and it had a vacuum that would suck their breath into the mannequin and collect the virus. They found almost all the virus was dead. And they said, in order to transmit the virus to another person you're speaking to, you're going to have to talk to them at least for 5 minutes. Well, who walks in a store and talks to everybody for 5 minutes in the store? You're just walking to go get what you want, and you go pay for it. Yeah. So the whole thing was ridiculous. They knew it was ridiculous. When you looked at states that had the most severe restrictions, their rates of infection and death and hospitalizations were no different than states that did.
Yeah, sometimes worse. I mean, they did state by state. I mean, fortunately, we have the federalist system of differentiation with decrees by state. And, North Dakota and South Dakota are almost identical ethnically by population size and so forth. And I forget which one, I think it was, which one did better, worse? I think was North Dakota put the mask on. So, and they had, the one without the mask did better. Our rates of Omicron cases and whatnot went down when we relaxed the mask mandates here earlier this year in the spring. Yeah, I'm totally with you on this, and it's been kind of a monkey show, to use our new term of art. People just say things and they do things, and they assume because they have a science degree that what they have just said is science.
Yeah, none of it was science, and they knew it. I mean, you can't take these people at this level and that they're fools. They're not fools. They knew the mask didn't work. Even Fauci laughed at it at first, and no, we need a mask. No, we need two masks. And then the cloth mask is very effective, and no, the cloth mask doesn't work. You need this N95 type mask. I mean, the story changed constantly. Nothing was consistent. Nothing was based on any science whatsoever. People started asking, well, where are the scientists? Why aren't they wading into this? Well, we found out the reason why, and I explained it in the article in some detail. Why aren't there autopsies being done? So we started asking these critical questions. Why weren't there any autopsies being done? Well, 140,000 people died before they did any autopsies. And then when they did them, there's just a handful, and they wouldn't even do complete autopsies.
So are you talking about this article we've been mentioning?
The update COVID, what's the truth article.
Yeah.
And it goes into this in detail. And so they were trying to tell the public, well, the reason they're not doing this is because the pathologists are afraid they'll contract COVID from the deceased person. And the pathologists began to write article after article published in peer-reviewed journals. That's a lie. We've been begging to do autopsies. Mm-hmm. We were told not to do them. And so you said, this is the best way to know about the pathophysiology of the virus and how best to treat it. And yet here's the authorities and the government and the public health telling them, don't do any autopsies. Now we have people dying in droves from the vaccine. And we have the same thing. We have to don't do any autopsies. Don't find out why they're dying. These people are dying of myocarditis, pericarditis, massive strokes. In neurosurgery, we rarely saw a superior sagittal sinus thrombosis or a transverse sinus thrombosis. They're having numerous of them in young people. You just didn't see that. I may have seen 2 or 3 in my entire career. Now they're reported all over the place. And when the morticians are looking at the dead bodies, they say, we've never seen clots like this. So all the vessels are filled with clots. We can't even inject the embalming fluid until we remove those clots. And when they look at the clots pathologically, they say, this is like nothing we've ever seen. Well, now we know because the pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, lied about the vaccine. And what they were lying about, they said, well, with this new technology, we inject it into your arm and it stays right there. And that's what's stimulating your immune system to fight this virus because it's producing spike protein. And what they found is, no, you hit a study and it was released by a court order. And the study said, no, that spike protein and the nanolipid carrier goes all over the whole body. It goes in every organ. They have very high concentrations in the female ovary and very high concentrations in the bone marrow and spleen. It goes to the liver, the heart, the brain. So they had lied. The vessels are filled with the spike protein.
Right.
Now, this nanolipid carrier holds the messenger RNA and protects it from being destroyed by your body. So it's producing massive amounts of this spike protein. Well, the spike protein is a toxic part of the virus. And so the vessel, this spike protein is attaching to the wall of the vessel, producing an inflammatory response and triggering thrombosis. So that's why these people are developing stroke. We've never seen so many strokes in young people.
So let me ask you, did you not get vaccinated?
No.
So Dr. Malone, I was on a kind of a Zoom lecture with him, and I got to ask him this, and he had the illness early on in in COVID-19 era in 2020, and then he went ahead and got the vaccine, and he got ill from the vaccine. And I asked him, had he ever taken a vaccine after an illness for which the vaccine was, labeled, and he said no. And I asked him why he had done that one, and I guess it's kind of the social pressure and whatnot, but I admire your hewing to principles and so forth. How has that kind of gone for you? But actually, I don't want to so much. You can answer that, but I'd kind of like to stick on the article a little bit because it is comprehensive. It's obviously a long piece, as I've shown people here. What are the key points for today? What was the kind of response, and what have you learned from writing this? And you have an update on the article as well. Maybe you could just touch on that in our last kind of 10, 12 minutes.
Yeah, I wrote an update just because of it sort of surprised me, the response to this. I expected to get a lot of feedback that was negative, but what I've got emails from all over the world praising the article, saying this is the first time we've seen all this put together in one article that made sense, that it was clear, it was understandable. We understand why this vaccine is dangerous. We understand why this virus and this so-called pandemic was handled different than any in the history of the world, and unprecedented things were done. Doctors' license were taken away if they criticized the treatment of the vaccine or had any questions about the official story that was being given by the government. They were removed from their hospital. These things are unprecedented. The hospital administrator has no business of telling its physicians how to practice medicine, but they were told you can't give ivermectin, and if you try to give it, we'll remove you from the hospital. And I know
that's a craziness. HIV still has no vaccine, and if we were waiting, abjuring medical treatment for HIV, waiting for the vaccine, it would be 40 years now, and people would be dying by droves. Clearly, treatment works for HIV. Let's just stick with HIV. There's no vaccine. We don't know if it will work or it won't. If people waited for the vaccine for HIV, they'd be dead, and so forth. So we have and Dr. Fauci was actually front and center with that. I think he actually did push, waiting for the vaccine early on. I have to corroborate that, but it's something I heard. So I'm not absolutely sure of that. But clearly it's an absurdity until a vaccine comes along. And in the case of HIV, you want to get treatment. And you can try the treatments. Not everything worked to the same extent. It seemingly, we have a lot of antiretrovirals which are reasonable, at least keeping people up and around on the right side of AIDS, as it were, even though they have HIV. So the absurdity in this case, taking of avoiding an off-patent reasonable medication, inexpensive and available worldwide, with the potential, at the very least, whether it's proved accurate or not, with at least the potential of benefit, is I think that's crass, unmedical, possibly criminal, and so forth. Ultimately, whether it is as good as some other medications, it remains to be seen. But to take it off the table when it was basically free and available in the absence of any vaccine, I think that's absurd. Has anyone ever explained that?
No, and this was, to me, a criminal activity. And McCullough and others had written a very good study showing that in their group of patients, so we're talking about thousands of COVID patients, they cut the mortality by 75% and hospitalizations by 80%. So why would you stop a treatment that has that profound effect on cutting mortality unless you have something else in mind, like a vaccine? And they don't want a treatment, because you can't get emergency use authorization of an experimental vaccine if there's an alternative treatment. And there were alternative treatments. Dr. Zelensky, who recently died, he had treated the largest number of COVID patients of anyone, and he had almost no death. Very few people needed any hospitalization. Almost everybody recovered outside of the
hospital. It became like Soviet samizdat, where it only could be passed around. You couldn't find it, and all the things you're talking about. People's physicians' licenses being threatened or withdrawn and so forth for using something that was standard medication for other illnesses. I mean, I think the inventor of ivermectin got the Nobel Prize, and it was never called horse dewormer for its other things. And I've searched the literature. I used the Google time filter, put it before 2019, and ivermectin was touted as an antiviral and had anti-lysosomal properties and so forth. And again, I'm not ready to announce it's a perfect cure for COVID. I think the studies are difficult in the presence of an active pandemic. I mean, I like double-blinded, randomized controlled studies. I don't think they've been done with ivermectin or pretty much any treatment. But notwithstanding, even if it's no worse than aspirin or something like that, why wouldn't you try it in the absence of a vaccine? That is horrible. And HCQ ditto. I don't necessarily have a horse in that race, but but shouting it down and making bad jokes and insults and so forth, that was counterproductive, and that's totally against the general public health, even though these people consider themselves public health officials.
Well, it went further than that, because here, if the family said, well, we want our loved one to get ivermectin, and the doctor agrees, I think, I've looked at the research, and there are randomized studies that were done that showed its effectiveness. Mm-hmm. And they want to do it. They both agree, the family and the doctor. Well, that's how medicine's supposed to work. But then steps the administrator of the hospital and says, no, if you give ivermectin, you will leave the hospital and lose your privileges. Yeah. And then the board, the medical board will say, and if you do that, we'll take your license away. So here the physician no longer has a profession, and the patient dies in the hospital because they're giving a dangerous medication, remdesivir, which we knew did not work. And we knew it had a high mortality rate, destroyed the kidneys, destroyed the lungs, and damaged the liver.
Yeah, I mean, the only difference seems to be that those are under patent, and that they are highly expensive and so forth. I mean, it's just
deadly. The remdesivir is deadly medication.
So the new one, Paxlovid, is Paxlovid, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is that related? And what are your thoughts about that one?
I don't know a lot about that one, but I think it is related and has a high complication rate. Right. They were even trying to get approval to use remdesivir in children and babies. That's criminal.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. One side note that I just reminded myself of was kind of this monoclonal antibody treatments, and in regard to the vaccine, they would phase in and out the monoclonal antibodies because the variant strains changed from the ancestral to then the succeeding Greek letters, skipping a few, but alpha, beta, delta, and so forth. And now we're in Omicron and Omicron strains, whatever. But they would have the monoclonal antibody treatment for alpha, and then when delta came along, they phased out that one. They brought in a delta one. When delta disappeared, they got rid of that one. So they had some concept that the monoclonal antibodies would only be for that variant strain. Yet at the same time, the purpose of vaccine is to produce those same monoclonal antibodies, but within you, using you instead of injecting them. And yet we did not update the vaccine antibody, the spike protein, to keep up with what the monoclonal antibodies were. There was phased in and phased out. And yet we kept the vaccine and called it a booster when clearly it was not. If that were the case, then the monoclonal antibodies would never be changed. You just using the original ancestral one. I don't know if I made that point clearly.
Well, I think the important thing is that this vaccine that they were requiring everybody to get at their place of work was for a virus that no longer existed, and no
Exactly.
one was saying that. This
And calling it a booster.
it was not for an existing virus. That virus disappeared and it mutated into a new one. And then they looked at that and said, well, it has no effectiveness whatsoever on the new one. Well, why did I lose my job because I refused to take a vaccine that's for no virus that exists?
Right.
And no one was asking that question. Yet people by the thousands were losing their occupations, businesses were closing, all kinds of things. But as far as these mutations, Gert Bossy, who's an expert, one of the top world experts on vaccines and viruses, has shown the more you vaccinate, the more these variants you're going to have, and the more deadly they're going to become.
Right. I mean, I think it's an analogy to like giving widespread antibiotics to cattle. You basically kind of get a resistance because it's not just you. You have a confrontation with another organism. But I'm going to give you the last couple minutes. So maybe if you have some closing statements and advice for our audience, and the stage is yours for the last few minutes.
Well, my view is that these people need to be held accountable. We need some extensive lawsuits filed against everyone who mandated this vaccine, this experimental vaccine. We need lawsuits against the FDA, the CDC, everybody who is involved in this charade, this fraud that has cost thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, has destroyed people's lives. Over 400,000 people are severely and permanently damaged by this vaccine in the United States alone. They need to have justice done. These people need to answer for what they've done. And we need a shakeup of the FDA, separate them completely from the pharmaceutical company. 75% of all their funds come from pharmaceutical companies. Now, how can they regulate drugs and vaccines when 75% of their funds come from the pharmaceutical company? Same for the CDC, same for Fauci. Fauci was pushing medications and injections that he profited from. I don't profit from anything. Dr. Malone's not getting any profit. None of us that are trying to tell the truth are getting any immunity rewards from any of this. Mm-hmm. Yet we're treated like, well, why are you saying this? Because it's the truth. That's why I'm saying it. And I'm not just going to sit still and watch you destroy human beings' lives down to little babies and say nothing when I know what's going on and the others know what this means and that we have to stop it before they produce a disaster it's beyond human comprehension. This pandemic was never reached the criteria for a pandemic. They changed the criteria to make it a pandemic. They knew that. So the level of this fraud that's gone on and the lives that have been lost because of it, we can't just sit still and let them do it, because what's next? What are they going to do the next time? With this monkeypox thing, it's total farce. You don't have an international public health emergency for a venereal disease. It's ridiculous. And the public needs to start listening to us. If we're wrong, good, prove we're wrong. I put the challenge out. Anything in my article that you say is wrong, come forward and prove it. I've had no one come forward. Out of all the responses I've got, I've only had 2 people with a negative response, and it was nothing but foul language and screaming and stamping their feet. Not one fact, not one article, not one proof that I was wrong. So that should tell you something. This pharmaceutical company has covered this up for, they went to the court and said, we want the safety information covered up for 75 years. Why would they do that? What explanation could you give that this phony safety study they did, they wanted to cover up 75 years? They only did 2 month safety studies. This is a brand new technology. They're supposed to study it for 10 years before they release it. Even the FDA said you should study it for 2 years. The pharmaceutical companies refused. Now, people need to answer for that.
I agree. So I'm going to end it there. I'm very much in your honor. You can stay on. We'll chat a little bit, but I want to say goodbye to our audience. As you can see, Dr. Blaylock is an amazing orator as well as a researcher, please feel free to contact him. You can look at the article and let us know what you think of this, and please pose your questions here and politely. So thank you so much. Nice to see you.